Welcome to the Old Roads podcast, a podcast that seeks to bring the wisdom of the past to the challenges of the present. I am your host, Aaron O'Kelly. I'm a pastor and a theological educator. Throughout the month of September, I've been talking about issues relating to marriage. And the question I want to think through today with you is, how should Christians think about singleness? At a basic level, of course, singleness is simply a condition of life that we all experience at one time or another. We're all born single, and then some of us remain single for life. Others may enter a stage of marriage and then perhaps become single again later, either through divorce or being widowed. But for those of you who are single in particular, I want to ask the question this way. As you consider your own condition of singleness, is it a condition that you should accept as permanent and not make great effort to change it? That's really the more pointed question related to this topic. And to answer that, I would say that depends. Depends on specific factors that I want to talk through today. There are two key biblical passages on this that I want to talk through for just a moment before diving into more specifics of answering that question. One of them is in Matthew 19, and that's in verses 10 to 12. And this is right after Jesus has given his instructions on divorce. And in response to Jesus' instructions, having been confronted about the question of divorce by the Pharisees and Jesus affirming the permanence of marriage, the disciples then said to him, according to Matthew 19:10, "If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry." And so the disciples picked up on the fact that Jesus said marriage is demanding. And it is a sacrificial commitment, and it is a commitment that you're in for the long haul. He does indicate in his teaching that there are biblical reasons to divorce, but we should consider marriage normatively to be permanent, lifelong, and a commitment that you cannot simply get out of when you feel like it. And the disciples, picking up on that Jesus' teaching on marriage is very rigorous, concluded, you know what, if that's how hard it's going to be, I think it's better not to get married at all. And then Jesus' response to them is very interesting in verse 11. But he said to them, "Not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this, receive it." When Jesus says in verse 11, not everyone can receive this saying, I believe he's referring to what the disciples just said, it is better not to marry. His point is, not everyone is able to live by that philosophy. For most people, it is actually better to marry. But there are some for whom it is better not to marry. And he goes on to speak of eunuchs who were born that way, those who are born with a certain condition that prevents them from getting married, or those who've been made eunuchs by men, those, in other words, who have been castrated so that they could serve in a royal court in some capacity, overseeing the king's harem, something of that nature. And then he says, interestingly, there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And here I don't think he's speaking literally of castration, but he's speaking more in terms of those who have devoted themselves to a life of celibacy and of singleness because they want to give wholehearted focus to the kingdom of heaven. And he concludes by saying, let the one who is able to receive this, receive it. The one, in other words, who has been gifted by God in a specific way for this life, let him receive it, but everyone else should pursue marriage. That seems to be Jesus' teaching. But what Jesus is doing here in this passage is showing that singleness is a legitimate option. And that was contrary to the mainstream Jewish view of his day. In the Jewish understanding, marriage was a requirement, an expectation, and you had to get married because you had to have children, and there were even expectations that if a couple was not able to conceive within a certain amount of time, that they had to divorce and pursue marriage elsewhere to try to produce children. So highly did they value children that they regarded marriage and bearing of children as pretty much a moral obligation. But Jesus is showing here in this teaching that there are legitimate reasons that one might remain single for life. The other important passage in the New Testament that addresses this issue is Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 7. Now, Paul addresses singleness at various points in this chapter, so I'm going to jump around to some different verses here. But he says in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 1 to 7. I won't read all that, but I'll just try to give the gist of what his argument is. He's essentially telling married couples that they are to give themselves to one another as a protection against sin. And then he says in verse 6, now as a concession, not a command, I say this, I wish that all were as I myself am, meaning single. Paul himself was single. He might have been widowed. We don't know that for sure, but we do know that he was a single man at the time of writing this. And he goes on to say, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. So Paul indicates in 1 Corinthians 7:7 that there are gifts that differ and that determine then whether we should be married or single. He goes on to tell those who are unmarried and widows in verse 8, and I believe when he speaks to the unmarried, he's speaking to widowers. So think of it this way, to the widowers and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. And so Paul tells those who have lost their spouses that if they can't exercise self-control, then marriage is the right path for them to pursue. But it is very good for them to remain single if they should so choose to do so. And then later in the passage, there's a lot of debate over verses 25 to 38 about exactly what situation Paul is addressing. I lean toward the view that he's addressing those who are betrothed, and he's speaking specifically to the betrothed and to the men to whom they are engaged. Some would argue that he's talking about fathers and their virgin daughters, but I lean toward speaking to betrothed couples. And along the way, Paul says this about marriage and singleness in verse 32, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. Now, prior to this, he had made reference to a present distress in verse 26. And there's debate about what he's talking about there with the present distress. I think there's good evidence that the city of Corinth was actually going through a time of famine when Paul was writing this. And so Paul seems to be referring, in my view, to a particular distress caused by this lack of food resources. And so those who are married, and especially those who have families, are finding that to be a very difficult thing to navigate. And so Paul says, because of that present distress, there are good reasons to remain single right now. Because if you're married, your driving concern is going to be, how do I feed my family? And that's a legitimate concern. And so I think Paul's giving advice that's somewhat unique to the situation in Corinth, but along the way, he's making bigger points as well that would apply at all times. And it is true that if you are not married, you have greater freedom to focus on pleasing the Lord. And if you are married, you have a lot of worldly concerns that come with that necessarily, that then prevent you from giving your undivided attention to serving the Lord in the ways that Paul was speaking of earlier. So what conclusions can we draw from these two passages and the broader biblical teachings? I would say that singleness certainly has certain advantages. And I believe that this is especially relevant for older people to consider, those who are perhaps divorced or widows and widowers. There are advantages to remaining single, and those should be taken seriously. And Paul speaks at length about what they are. Jesus speaks to them a little bit, but there are things to consider. I do believe as well that some people are gifted and or they are providentially directed to lifelong singleness. They are gifted. I typically don't say they are gifted with singleness. I don't believe singleness itself is the gift. Singleness is a condition that we're all in at one time or another. I believe the gift is actually celibacy. It's a gift, the ability to exercise control over one's desires in a way that is conducive to living a single life long-term without being given to a pattern of sin. So some are gifted in that way, and some are gifted and or providentially directed in that way so that they remain in lifelong singleness. But I would argue this is not the norm. We do have passages that address singleness, but the norm for most people is marriage. My normal advice to young people would be this: pursue marriage unless you have very, very, very strong reasons not to. That's my advice. Make that your default mode. I am going to pursue getting married. If I'm young and I have my life ahead of me, that is the direction I'm going to default to. And I will only not do that if it becomes very, very clear to me that I should not. Why do I take that approach? Well, number one, as Paul testifies in 1 Corinthians 7, marriage will help you fight against sexual sin. That is one important aspect of the marriage covenant. And so if you are a person with normal sexual desire, then that's going to be a difficult fight to wage for the rest of your life. And God has given marriage as an institution to help you fight that. And that's an important thing to consider. Paul says it's better to marry than to burn with passion. So make that an important consideration for yourself. A second reason is that marriage should have a sanctifying effect on your character. Yes, there are sanctifying elements of singleness, but marriage can often force us to grow up in certain ways. Men who are forced to be providers and leaders in their homes have to grow up a bit oftentimes to step into that role. They have to recognize that I'm not just living for myself any longer. I have a wife and I have children who are depending on me to show up and to provide and to lead. And that can have a very sanctifying effect on one's character when you are forced to take into consideration the fact that I cannot just live for myself anymore, but others are depending on me. And then, of course, women have to learn how to respect their husbands and to manage a household. And oftentimes that too requires growing up a bit. And so marriage has a sanctifying effect on us by God's design. And then a third reason is that marriage is the proper context for bearing and raising children. And as Christians, we should be very pro-child. This is why I speak more specifically to young people rather than to old people who may be beyond the point of bearing children in their lives now. For young people especially, consider this. Birth rates are too low in the Western world. We are not even producing enough children to replace the current population. We've been told for generations that children are a threat to the environment and that overpopulation is a looming threat and it's going to result in catastrophes for the planet and for the human race in the future. And all of those claims have been demonstrably proven false. The truth is we do not have enough people being born in the Western world to replace the current population. What will be the consequences of that? What happens when a future generation doesn't have enough workers to support its economy and to support the entitlement programs upon which the older population will depend in the future? What's going to happen to Social Security when there's not enough workers to pay in to support the number of retirees who are drawing it? What's going to happen to a society where population falls at the rate that it's falling for us right now? I don't think we know fully all the consequences of that, but they will be major consequences, and we need more children to be born. And so I would argue for young people, think about how good it is for society for you to marry and to raise children with a mother and a father in the home whom you can nurture in the faith and then send out into the world to serve the Lord Jesus Christ. What an amazing contribution that is to his mission in this world. How much do you value that possibility for your future? The institution of the family is the bedrock of a society, and the family is under attack in America today and throughout the Western world. As Christians, we need to fight back against that attack. We need to value marriage and family, and we need to make the pursuit of marriage the default for those who are young and of marriageable age. So the bottom line here for me is that, yes, some people should be single for life, but not many. That seems to be the testimony of Scripture, and that seems to fit with our experience as human beings. So if you are young, I don't want you to end up single for life because you didn't make the effort, or because you prioritized career, or because you enjoyed the freedoms of the single life too much. If you are in your late teens, your 20s, or your 30s, now is the time to think in the direction of what you want the rest of your life to look like. Don't wait until some future day when you've got all these other things in place. Think about that now. When you are on your deathbed, think of it this way. Who will be gathered around you? Who will be there when you pass from this life, holding your hand as you breathe your last? Will there be anyone? Or will it just be medical personnel or nursing home personnel? Who do you want that to be? I hope to have children, grandchildren around me, and I hope that's the same for you as well. But what do you need to do now to make that happen in the future? Think about that. That's an important question, and it's one that in the vibrancy and fun of youth, we can often forget or simply neglect to think about. So yes, singleness has its advantages, and especially for those who are older and who have become single through divorce or widowhood, that is certainly something to consider, especially Paul's teaching. But if you're young, then I would argue you need to think in terms of getting married unless the Lord makes it abundantly clear that that is not the pathway for you. If you benefited from this podcast, would you consider subscribing on your favorite podcast app? Leave us a 5-star review so that word can get out to others. And most importantly, share this podcast with a friend. You can send questions for our monthly Q&A episode to theoldroadspodcast@gmail.com. And if you'd like to sign up as a patron to help this ministry financially, you can go to theoldroadspodcast.com. We're starting to roll out some content that is only for patrons, and we will continue to do that more in the future. So until next time, remember Jeremiah 6:16, "Thus says the Lord, stand by the roads and look and ask for the ancient paths where the good way is, and walk in it and find rest for your souls."